Cal Ripken got 98.5. You're like, what was the 1.5%, which is probably like 3 people or whatever, that decided Cal Ripken is not a Hall of Famer on my ballots? I'm always curious people's thought process on that, when you see some of those totals. And again, the fact that there were people that said, yeah, Babe Ruth, not really a Hall of Famer in my opinion, like, really? I mean, it was a foregone conclusion he was going to be in the first class. Of course, that first Hall of Fame class, legendary. Ty Cobb, Babe Ruth, Honus Wagner, Christy Mathewson, Walter Johnson. And it just amazes me that there were a couple of people in that voting that said, Babe Ruth doesn't deserve it. It's just fun. And even Ty Cobb, 2 people said, hey, Ty Cobb doesn't deserve it. So that circles us back around here, talking about the first years there. You've got those newcomers. Before we look at guys coming back on, we talked a little Biggio. Look at those newcomers, particularly the 3 that we mentioned. Randy Johnson, the big unit, to me, of everybody. I mean, really, all 3 of those pitchers, I can't make an argument for them not going in, especially when you look back last year. You look and you compare them to Maddox and Glavine, who went in, and I think, bam, you're right along the same line, same level of pitchers when you're talking about Johnson, Martinez, and then Smoltz was the third of the 3-man crew there, kind of, with the Braves.
Right, and if you look at individual guys, if you wanted to rank all 4 of those guys, I would put Randy Johnson and Pedro Martinez ahead of Tom Glavine. As great as Glavine was, but I think, Pedro and Randy Johnson were a little bit better. So I think if Glavine goes in right off the bat, I think you got to put, Johnson and Pedro as well. Of course, we know how great Pedro has been over a long career. His ERA was a run and a half better than the entire league over his whole career. He's just on a different plane. And then, of course, you had Randy Johnson just smoking people left and right, with 9 strikeout titles. I mean, he's basically easily the best left-hander of our time, and even perhaps the last 40, 50 years. I mean, when you talk about lefties all time, you might be talking pretty much about Walter Johnson, Koufax, and then Randy Johnson.
Yeah, I'm with you. You and I, Pedro Martinez, I'm with you. I'm on a lower plane than, to me, Randy Johnson stands above Pedro there, stands above the rest of those guys when you look at the newcomers on the ballot. The big unit, what is it, nearly 5,000 career strikeout, 4,875 career strikeout, and then balance that out with the fact that he only walked less than 1,500 people. His walk-to-strikeout ratio for a guy that threw it as with the potential to be as wild as he could have been, amazing there, man. We know firsthand. I mean, you and I, Indians fans out there, Randy Johnson to me is an easy one to think back, and we remember in the Kingdome, Kenny Lofton and those battles, and maybe I've got a better appreciation because that was right in my childhood, my teenage years, the video game era when you had Ken Griffey Jr. baseball, and the Mariners were a big deal because Nintendo, but Nintendo had a piece of the Mariners, and so they made the Mariners a big deal on the video. So to me, I knew all about, the Mariners and Randy Johnson, but we saw him firsthand. Tribe had some great battles with those teams, so maybe we've got a better appreciation, much like a guy like Edgar Martinez, but seeing him like that where some people go, DH only. But anyway, Randy Johnson, to me, there's no doubt that when they make this announcement, I think Randy Johnson joins that select list of first ballot Hall of Famers.
I think he definitely does. And, of course, he's probably not going to be, unanimous. Of course, you talked about that. Right. It makes me wonder if anybody ever is going to.
It's never happened. Never happened.
The one person who you think that would be Jeter. But then there's going to be a couple of anti-Yankee backlash guys against Jeter, and even he's probably not going to make it. It's crazy. I still don't know who these old, hard-drinking, cigar-chomping sports writers were back in the old days who didn't put Babe Ruth in on the first ballot. That's just crazy. But, yeah, I think that Randy Johnson's in, I think Pedro's in, and Smoltz, I think, Smoltz is another guy who might have made it on the first ballot if it weren't for Johnson and Pedro. I think he might make it. He might have to wait a year or so, just because, because he's in looking at last year and this year with all these top quality pitchers, although Smoltz has got to give him credit, being a great starter, winning a Cy Young, and then transforming into a great reliever. I think only Dennis Eckersley can come to mind as far as someone who went from a really good starter to a really good reliever, although Smoltz was, I believe, a better starter than Eckersley was.
But that's a good point because a lot of people don't remember that he did the switch at the end of the career and was able to be a good closer there as well. That's something to play into his. I agree. I don't think he's first ballot, but I definitely think he'll eventually make his way in there. Looking, by the way, before we go into some of the other guys, at the other first ballot guys, some interesting names. I laugh at Brian Giles just because, everybody's put on the list once. Well, no, everybody is put on the list when you reach that year of being eligible or whatnot. Brian Giles, baby, former, and we know Indians made a bad trade there. That would have been some good pop in their lineup. But, you see an interesting name like a Nomar Garciaparra, and, not, in my opinion, not a Hall of Famer, but a lot of people could make arguments, about it. What are your feelings? Not this year necessarily, first ballot, but about the qualifications of a guy like Nomar.
Well, Nomar, I think, is going to get a lot of East Coast, votes because, that they were really into him and when he was big with the Red Sox. But unfortunately, I think his career really got cut short by injury. I think if he were able to stay healthier and be able to play at a high level, he would have really been kind of an icon in Baltimore and Boston, I should say, even more, almost like their version of Jeter. Of course, the team not as successful as the Yankees were, but he just didn't have that long of a career to get that kind of staying power to really push him over that level to even be higher than even Barry Larkin for the Reds. So I think that he kind of doesn't even make it to Larkin's level simply because of the injuries cutting short his career.
Yeah, absolutely. Another guy that I think is right in that area. There, like you said, there's the Hall of Very Good and then the Hall of Fame. You've got like a Carlos Delgado. I remember Delgado had some good years for the with the Blue Jays, and but at the end of the day, those are marginal guys. Garciaparra higher. I'm just kind of equating guys in that area. But yeah, when you start looking at some of the other guys, especially too now, when you look at guys just looking at last year and the percentages that they got. When you look at a guy like Jeff Kent, remember he had a little bit of a time here with the Indians, but he got 15% of the vote last year, and you compare his numbers to he's comparable to some of those guys there, and then obviously as you look at the bottom of the guys voted in last year, you see the bias again. And I'm with it. I'm all about keeping the steroid guys out, except I don't know how to figure out who to let in at that point. That's somebody else's problem, not mine. But an interesting question when you look at the guys, and I'm just curious, we're talking about guys at the front end. Is the back end. There's 3 names that finished in the top 17 last year that are all the opposite of most of these guys here, first, second, third year, fourth year that are up on the ballot. You've got guys like Lee Smith, Alan Trammell, Don Mattingly. All 3 of those guys in their 13th, 14th, and 15th years, respectively, on the ballot. Don Mattingly is one that, I grew up on Don Mattingly. So he was, a big name. And I think sometimes that's always where fans have to separate from people that are really trying to break down Hall of Fame balloting, because Don Mattingly's a big name and one that you'll remember from that era. But 15 years now, Don Mattingly, 13 years, Lee Smith, 14 years, Alan Trammell, all still trying to get in the Hall of Fame, and none really getting any closer.
It's hard because you look at those guys and you pair them up with other guys and say, well, if this guy's in, well, why isn't this guy in? Because when I think about Lee Smith as a closer in the 80s, I think of also guys like Jeff Reardon and Bruce Sutter. And I know Sutter's in. I think Reardon's in too, isn't he?
You know what? I'll have to look on that, to be honest with you. You keep going.
Yeah, Sutter I know is in. I still have his baseball glove with his signature in from when I was 10. Alex Trammell, you connect him right with Lou Whitaker. Those two played all the way through their career as a double play combination. You hardly ever see that. And I think Whitaker's in. I'm going to, again, don't quote me on that. I don't know if he is or not, actually. But, Trammell, again, he's right there. He's right on the border, and that's the thing. If it almost is like if you have to wonder, if you have to think about it, is this guy? If you have that doubt, then almost that kind of means the answer is no. And then we look at guys like Mattingly, of course. Being on a high-profile team like the Yankees, he had a very good career, but I wouldn't put him as an individual. He blended in very well with a very good team, but I wouldn't put him as as an individual talent as high as a guy like Wade Boggs or something. I think that Mattingly kind of falls a little bit short when you talk about guys like Frank Thomas and Wade Boggs, and he's just not quite to that level. So I would say no on Mattingly, probably no on Trammell. I would kind of lean toward yes on Lee Smith. I think that if Bruce Suter's in there, I think Lee Smith should be in there too. I think Smith might even have more saves, and he had a very long career too. He was there for a long time.
Smith hanging around that 30% mark last year. I looked up Jeff Reardon, and I'll tell you two interesting things that came out of that. One, no, you're not even close. He's nowhere near the Hall of Fame, but he was at one point in time the saves leader for a season before Lee Smith broke his record. But he did replace Raleigh Fingers there. But here's just something for all of you athletes and just regular folks out there too. You never know what happens when you Google search somebody. The first picture that came up when I Google searched Jeff Reardon was a very bad mugshot photo when he was arrested. He apparently had a drug-induced insanity rage, tried to rob a place. I think he tried to rob a jewelry store, it looks like. And then he spent several months in a psychiatric facility, and he had to undergo electroshock treatment. Wikipedia will tell you all of this stuff. And was eventually found not guilty by reason of drug-induced insanity. The judge ended up finding out that he had been taking antidepressants and his son died. And the combination of the depression and the drugs that he was put on gave him a drug-induced insanity. And he was found not guilty for the armed robbery. So they're just out of nowhere. We're talking about the Hall of Fame. You bring up Jeff Reardon. That's a crazy story that I didn't know happened. But, yeah.
I know. I don't remember this either.
Apparently, Jeff Reardon had some stuff. But, yeah, there you go. I didn't know that was in a defense there. So, but, yeah, just be careful. You never know what picture will pop up. It was the craziest-looking mugshot there. Yeah, that's a Hall of Fame stat right there, Bruce. You never know what you're going to get. It's like Forrest Gump said, the sports fix is like a box of chocolates, man. You never know what you're going to get, man. I'll tell you, though, looking at some of these other names here, some other guys that came close. You got your top 3 or 4. Your top 3 that all finished 50% or above. And even then, the gap is still, 54%. There's a lot of votes between that and getting to 75% of the voting. But yeah, Jeff Bagwell, who was the other half of the B&B there with the Astros, we talked about Biggio earlier, and Mike Piazza, there's another one. I've always been partial to Piazza because I grew up in that era again. But, he was another guy that I wonder if, is perhaps, I mean, it's hard when you start to get a grouping of so many similar players in because each one siphons away from the others a little bit,
Right, and it's hard once you're in that 50%. That sounds like a lot, but it's hard to get positive momentum and get that many more people to start voting for you. It's almost like if you're not near that 75% marker, you're really got almost nowhere to go but to slide back down. And it's really too bad in the case of Piazza, considering what a very strong career he had. And when you think about it, and you think about this era, the era of free agency compared to the old days, I think a guy like Piazza probably would have had a better chance of making it into the Hall of Fame if he had just played on one team throughout his entire career. Like if he was the Dodgers catcher for, say, 15, 18 years. I think that makes him a little more of an iconic player, someone like Johnny Bench for the Reds or someone like Carlton Fisk, although he did go from the Red Sox to the White Sox, but he's mostly considered with the Red Sox, or Roy Campanella, Yogi Berra, you mentioned, kind of an iconic catcher who was just a catcher for this team for like almost 2 decades, and boy, he was just synonymous with this team. But of course, you had Piazza switching over to the Marlins for about 2 seconds, and then to the Mets for another several years. So I think I think when players change hands like that, unfortunately, it almost makes them a little bit less special when it comes down to Hall of Fame time, rather than somebody like DiMaggio or Clemente, where that you're only associated with just that one team.
For sure. And what? Part of that, though, with today's era, it's hard to hold that against guys because how many people stay with one team? As much as I wish they would. We talk about it all the time. Nobody does that anymore. So you are right. But you're going to get less and less of that to where it's going to stand out more and more. Another name, real quick, that I wanted to ask you about that I'm We mentioned earlier, it's like perfect tie into this when you're talking about the three pitchers at the top of the first time in this year with Johnson, Martinez, and Smoltz, because I would put Curt Schilling under Randy Johnson and definitely above the other two. Smoltzy, it's close. I've got Martinez as the lowest of those three, by the way. But Curt Schilling, to me, right underneath Randy Johnson, but would get in before either of those other two that we talked about earlier. That's another guy that it's only his third year on the ballots, and he's hovering around that 30% mark. But